morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
He doesn't say that anymore. So let me just tell you that I heard and I watched, and the one thing I'll say is they kept saying about what I said right after the insurrection. Because I think it was an insurrection caused by Nancy Pelosi. This was an insurrection, if it was an insurrection, which there were no guns, there were no anything except for the fact that they shot Ashley Babbitt. Somebody from police force shot Ashley Babbitt. So unnecessary, so sad.
So in other words, it was an insurrection. That certainly is helpful considering literally today in the Supreme Court, Trump's lawyers claim that January 6th was by no means an insurrection, saying this.
Question. The Colorado Supreme Court concluded that the violent attempts of the petitioner's supporters in this case to halt the count on January 6th qualified as an insurrection, as defined by Section 3. And I read your opening brief to accept that those events counted as an insurrection, but then your reply seemed to suggest that they were not. So what is your position as to that?
We never accepted or conceded in our opening brief that this was an insurrection. What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, so why would this not be an insurrection? What is your argument that it's not? Your reply brief says that it wasn't because I think you say it did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow the government. So
that's one of many reasons. But for an insurrection, there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence. And this
so your point is that a chaotic effort to overthrow the government is not an insurrection?
No, we didn't concede that it's an effort to overthrow the government either, Justice Jackson. Right? None of these criteria were met. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection as that term is used in Section 3.
Thank you.
Because
that it couldn't plausibly be characterized as an insurrection, only, of course, for Donald Trump to come out on the day that his lawyers made that argument and concede that, in fact, it was an insurrection. Brilliant gambit, Donald. Brilliant gambit. And just as a quick aside, I'd like to extend my sincere congratulations to Nikki Haley for her apparent exoneration, considering only weeks ago, Trump said this.
By the way, they never report the crowd on January 6th. You know, Nikki Haley, you know, did you know they destroyed all of the information, all of the evidence, everything, deleted and destroyed all of it, because of lots of things. Like Nikki Haley is in charge of security. We offered her 10,000 people, soldiers, National Guard, so whatever they want. They turned it down. They don't want to talk about that.
And considering Nikki Haley wasn't even in Washington, D.C. or in Congress on January 6th, it must be quite the vindication for her to finally be absolved of her culpability in allowing the insurrection to continue. And when I say insurrection, again, Donald Trump's words, not mine. And look, my own snark aside, the notion that Donald Trump sicking an angry mob of armed sycophants onto the Capitol for the express purpose of stopping the certification of a free and fair election, with those insurrectionists admitting that their goal was to assassinate anyone who stood in their way, is anything but an insurrection, is laughable. You could design an insurrection in a lab, it would quite literally look like what happened on January 6th. So Trump and his mouthpieces can try to memory hole what happened on that day, they can try to will into existence this idea that they were peaceful protesters, or that it was a false flag operation, or that the FBI or the DOJ was responsible, or that Hugo Chavez himself emerged from the grave. All of it is nothing more than a desperate effort to convince us not to believe our own eyes. And no matter how hard they try, it's not going to work. Now, as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, I spoke with the nation's premier voting rights attorney and my Democracy Watch co-host Mark Elias, and here's what he had to say.
I don't think that there are a majority of the court to uphold the disqualification. I mean, you know, you can never predict with certainty, but I think that the conservative justices came out of the box pretty much trying to take the position and or advocating the position and adopting the position that, you know, that without Congress passing a special law, that there is no that there's no disqualification. So I think to get to the punchline up front, I don't believe Donald Trump is going to be disqualified. That is not to say that there were not some really important nuggets that came out of today. One of them is the rest of the quote from the section we've just been discussing. Donald Trump's lawyer stood up in a court of law, the U.S. Supreme Court, and then said the events were shameful, criminal, violent. Okay, so he says they're not an insurrection, but that they were shameful, criminal, and violent. Well, Donald Trump's got a whole lot of legal proceedings in front of him that hinge on the question of whether or not the events of that day were criminal and violent. And it's quite interesting, Donald Trump's lawyer, I'm sure when he said that, was thinking, I got to win the case today. We'll worry about tomorrow. But those are very, very significant words, because Donald Trump's entire criminal legal defense is this was a love fest. This was a peaceful demonstration. This wasn't violent at all.
So it remains to be seen how the Supreme Court will rule on this case, but let's remember that the court has proven every which way that it is a partisan institution, not unlike Congress or the White House, and its conservative members will bend over backwards to protect Donald Trump in the same way that his mouthpieces in Congress will do. To that point, we cannot rely on the courts to save us. We can't rely on the lawyers or election officials or elected officials. It has to be us individually who is responsible for our friends and families and neighbors and coworkers, so that everyone knows what's at stake. January 6th wasn't the end, it was the beginning. It was a blueprint. It let the MAGA faction know where the weaknesses in the system were that still need to be overcome if they were to try this again. And so whereas certain secretaries of state and governors held out for the rule of law, they are being primaried. Whereas Mike Pence wouldn't unilaterally block certification, Trump will seek as his new running mate a loyalist. Whereas too many minorities and young people were able to cast ballots in 2020, Republicans are seeking to suppress their votes with laws in different states. So mark my words, it will happen again, and it'll happen knowing full well what didn't go their way the first time. And finally, I know there are worries about the polling. Who cares? Polling is a snapshot in time, and a lot can change in a day, a lot can change in a week, and certainly a lot can change in 10 months. In January of 2020, for example, I doubt anyone in this country knew that we would be Lysol wiping our mail and washing off bananas in the sink within 2 months. The point is that regardless of what any polls say, we still have to move forward as if Trump is up by 90 points. The stakes are too great to be overly cynical, and they're too great to be overly complacent. We keep working, we keep organizing, we keep beating the drum on a daily basis about the abject dangers posed by a second Trump term. Do not assume that we've all heard it before or that we'll get tired of hearing it, because the last thing we should do is create a vacuum that Republicans will then fill. Voters rejected Trump and his extremism and his chaos in 2020, and it's on us to make sure that no one forgets that it's only gotten worse over the last 4 years. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to the channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on this screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.